Imagine a city where there are no cars or streets, where everything you need is within a 5-minute walk. A straight line of glass cutting through the desert, 170 kilometers long and 500 meters high. A city so ambitious that it promises to house up to 10 million people and run exclusively on renewable energy. A project so grandiose that it seems straight out of a science fiction movie. But what if I told you that this city is being built right now? That drones have already captured real excavations in the middle of the desert, and that billions of dollars are being buried under the scorching heat of a nearly uninhabitable land. This is the story of The Line, a mega-urban project that was born as a symbol of a bright future, and that today walks dangerously between dream and failure. At the beginning of 2021, the world was still recovering from the pandemic. The mood was one of uncertainty, anxiety, and an almost desperate search for signs of hope. It was in this scenario that a video lasting just a few minutes flashed across the world's screens like a bolt of lightning. It showed a linear city with 2 glass walls stretching out into the desert as far as the eye could see. The narration spoke of an urban revolution, a city without cars, without pollution, without waste. "The future of civilization begins here," said the voice in a solemn tone. The promise was clear: to build a city from scratch, planned for the next generations, where everything, absolutely everything, would be redesigned with a focus on sustainability, efficiency, and technology. Called The Line, the city would be just one part of an even larger project involving artificial intelligence, robotics, and automated industrial zones. But the line was the heart, the jewel of the empire. The reactions came in waves. On one side, engineers, architects, and urban planners were fascinated. After all, this was a unique opportunity to rethink the way we live. On the other, a flood of skepticism. How could a city 170 kilometers long, in a straight line, with 2 half-kilometer-high glass walls, be built in just 8 years? The doubts were not unfounded. The promotional videos did not show any real construction work. Only beautiful CGI renderings, it is true, but purely conceptual. The world was accustomed to futuristic announcements that never got off the ground. And for many, the line was just another megalomaniac delirium, an idea too bold for the times we live in. Even so, there was something there that could not be ignored. Something in the tone, the scale, the boldness of the project that stirred the collective imagination. It was as if we were faced with a rare opportunity to witness the creation of the world's first truly futuristic city. But time passed, and no real images surfaced. No construction work, no excavations, just silence and more conceptual videos. For almost 2 years, the line lived in the limbo between the possible and the impossible, until suddenly, the first images captured by drones began to emerge, and the world realized that something great was really starting to happen. For a long time, the line seemed more like a digital experiment than a real project. The videos were impressive, but they seemed too far from reality. Then, in mid-2022, something changed. Satellite images began to circulate, showing a long, narrow scar in the middle of the desert, a trench of colossal dimensions, stretching for kilometers in a straight line. It was as if someone had opened the earth with a gigantic razor. Shortly after, drones confirmed it. Excavators, trucks, temporary camps, and frantic movement in the middle of nowhere. It was no longer fiction. The line had left PowerPoint and entered the hot, inhospitable soil of the desert. What many considered impossible was now taking shape, or, at least, a hole. The excavation followed a precise path, as if obeying a millimeter-calculated plan. But it was not the entire city that was being built. Instead of the promised 170 kilometers. The focus was on a tiny fraction of the project, a strip just 2.4 kilometers long. The new plan was simple and yet incredibly audacious. It was to create a mini-line, an experimental stretch of the futuristic city divided into 3 main modules: 45, 46, and 47. This mini-line was not just a sample. It was the new core of the project. The idea was to build enough of it to prove that the line could work, like a full-scale prototype. And it was in this initial stretch that the world saw the first concrete signs of progress. Module 45 began to emerge from the ground, with deep foundations and support structures. Module 47 had its excavations accelerated, and between the two, a complex network of underground tunnels began to be installed, with a colossal drainage system designed to withstand extreme storms and prevent flooding. The numbers were impressive. In Phase 1 alone, more than 16,000 piles were needed to stabilize the ground, a number that made the Burj Khalifa, with its 192 piles, seem small. The engineering involved was on another level, something unprecedented even by the standards of the largest projects on the planet. But there was one detail that drew special attention: the location. The area chosen to begin construction was in the Gal region, a virtually uninhabited area with extreme weather and limited access, an inhospitable place where every meter built required effort, logistics, and money on a gigantic scale. Still, work continued. Module 45 was moving forward. The concrete was beginning to appear. For the first time, the world could see something tangible, something that wasn't just a glossy animation. There was steel, dust, machinery, and sweat. And for a brief moment, it seemed as if the impossible was about to happen. But the desert has its own way of testing the endurance of human dreams. And soon, the project would face its most turbulent phase. The escalation of the construction of the mini-line brought with it a new wave of expectation. The world turned its eyes to this geometric cut in the desert, while investors and enthusiasts celebrated each new drone image. But behind the cameras and official statements, something was beginning to change quietly but profoundly. In an unexpected turn of events, the CEO responsible for the project was replaced. And with him, other high-ranking executives also left their positions. The justifications were vague, speaking of strategic restructuring, adjusting goals, and focus on efficiency. But behind the scenes, experts began to whisper what many feared. The line was facing serious financial challenges. The numbers spoke for themselves. The estimated cost of completing the entire city had surpassed the $8.8 trillion mark, more than 8 times the GDP of many developed countries. A figure so disproportionate that it seemed absurd even by mega-project standards. And even the mini-line, with its 2.4 kilometers already accumulated, projected costs close to $370 billion. All of this to build 3 modules in the middle of the desert. The project then began operating in a new mode: modular, gradual, with a total focus on Phase 1. Modules 45, 46, and 47 became the obsession. Each of them was 800 meters long and an impressive 500 meters high. The original ambition remained, but now with a more pragmatic and more desperate tone. Among the structures under construction, 2 elements caught the world's attention: the hidden marina and the neon stadium. The marina would be underground, connecting the line to an invisible waterway on the surface, a futuristic solution for logistical access and transportation. Meanwhile, the neon stadium, planned for Module 46, was announced as a possible venue for the 2034 World Cup, a symbol of prestige and geopolitical stakes. However, the engineering involved bordered on the unimaginable. The foundations required underground drainage systems on an unprecedented scale, capable of handling the volume of water from rare but catastrophic floods. Every meter built required geological preparation, digital monitoring, and heavy infrastructure. And what was sold as fluidity and efficiency, in practice required a monumental logistical effort. Entire fleets of trucks crossed the desert daily, carrying materials, workers, and equipment to a region where there was nothing. Entire camps were erected to house thousands of workers. Satellite images showed rows of temporary structures growing around the construction site, like small makeshift cities. But as the expenses multiplied, so did the questions. To what extent was this experiment sustainable? Were they building a new model of city, or just burning resources on an idea too beautiful to fail? Criticism began to gain ground, and for the first time, doubt ceased to be external and began to corrode the very core of the project. While the first modules of the mini-line were taking shape, the project as a whole faced a cruel contradiction. There had never been so much talk about the future, but everything around it seemed stuck in the present. The initial goal, to build 170 kilometers of city by 2030, began to be treated as unrealistic, even within the development team itself. The new, more cautious strategy was clear. Build slowly, test everything, prove that the line could work on a small scale before thinking about expanding. And it was in this climate that other parallel projects began to gain visibility. The floating city of Oxagon, for example, promised to be an innovative industrial hub designed on the water, with automated production zones and clean energy. In the drone images, outlines of metal structures on the high seas could already be seen, docks being built, and vessels in operation. Wind farms were also identified emerging in the arid landscape, huge towers powered by the region's extreme winds, pointing to a real effort to fulfill the promise of 100% renewable energy. And all around the mini-line, workers' encampments were expanding, like scars of civilization carved into the desert. Yet the prevailing feeling was one of slowness. What was supposed to be an epic march toward the future was beginning to feel like a silent battle against reality. Investigative journalists, renowned urban planners, and independent engineers began to raise uncomfortable questions. Why were so many top executives leaving the project? What justifies so many billions invested in a tiny fraction of the original proposal? Was there transparency in the spending? And most important, was there a concrete plan to make the city livable? This last question was the most uncomfortable, because no matter how many modules were raised, no matter how much concrete went up and the structures gained volume, something fundamental was missing: people. The line's proposal was not just architectural, but social. It was a complete reinvention of urban life. But how could anyone be persuaded to move to an experimental city, isolated, unfinished, surrounded by construction sites and desert on all sides? What kind of life would be possible there in the first few years? How would mobility, healthcare, education, and daily routines work? Everything seemed designed to work on a large scale, but the scale did not yet exist. The promise was of a living, vibrant, connected city. But what was seen was concrete, dust, and silence. The 2030 goals, which had already been viewed with skepticism, began to be treated as impossible. Not officially, never officially, but in internal reports, technical analyses, and hallway conversations. The optimistic discourse continued in the institutional videos, but behind the scenes, realism prevailed. The line was no longer a sprint toward the future. It was a marathon with no guaranteed finish line. At first, the plan was ambitious. By 2030, the line would be nearly complete, with hundreds of thousands of people living in an ultra-technological, self-sustainable linear city interconnected by artificial intelligence. But now, With time running out and the scale reduced to an experimental fraction, the question stopped being when and started being, will it happen? The 3 initial modules are still under construction, but even this phase, much smaller than the original project, requires a logistical and financial effort that few countries could afford. It is estimated that the 2.4-kilometer mini line will cost around $370 billion, a gigantic number considering that it represents only 1.4% of the total proposal. And even if this first part is successfully completed, the most profound challenge would still remain, making it habitable. According to the most recent plans, the goal is to attract around 300,000 people to live on the mini line by the middle of the next decade, a number necessary to justify the existence of the city and validate its urban concept. But attracting residents to an experimental, isolated, and constantly under construction city is more difficult than convincing investors. Because it is not about money, it is about life. Who will be the first inhabitants? Ordinary people, families, young professionals, visionaries, or just employees of partner companies and workers linked to the project itself? What will the level of freedom, mobility, and comfort be in the first years? And what incentive would someone have to exchange a consolidated city for an environment still in formation? These questions echo among analysts, experts, and even former collaborators of the project. Because there is something deeper than concrete and glass being tested here, the concept of the city as a human experience. The success of the line depends not only on technology and engineering, but on the ability to create meaning, belonging, and community in a space that, for now, is still empty. There are those who believe that the mini line will be completed and that, over time, it will be able to expand. There are those who see value in projects that force humanity to rethink its limits. But there are also those who see in the line the ultimate symbol of a future designed above reality, where the dream is greater than the conditions to make it viable. Today, the excavations continue. The concrete goes up, the satellites watch, and the world watches, divided between admiration and skepticism. In the end, the question remains, will they be able to finish the mini line? Will we ever see the 170 kilometers? Or are we, once again, faced with a promise buried in the sand? If you've come this far, it's because this story made you think. So take the opportunity to like the video, comment on what you thought of this futuristic project, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the next stories we bring here. What would you do if you could live in a city like this? Would you be up for this experiment? I'd love to hear your opinion in the comments. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.